Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning to you. You. Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning, good morning to you. All right. I hope everybody is having a great and wonderful day. Yeah, I hope everybody is having a great and wonderful day. How is everyone? Put some hearts on the screen if you're having a great and wonderful day. Wonderful. Awesome sauce. Glad to see those hearts pumping. If you would do me a favor by sharing this broadcast out. I noticed that when I tag my Twitter feed, that is one of the ways that I start getting my video cut off. So I don't know if it's somebody through Twitter who is reporting my video and that's what's causing my video to shut down, but I'm not tagging my Twitter name. So if you would share it out, that would be helpful. All right. Again, I want to remind those of you who watch me every single day to please not inbox me from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. When you do that, it actually interrupts the broadcast and sometimes sound goes out. And so people who are watching live get muted. So if you respect what I'm doing from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., don't inbox me. That's as nice as I could possibly say it right now. Don't inbox me. Don't text message me. Don't call me. All right? If you do so before 11, I can get your message. If you do so after 12, I'll be happy to take your message. All right? Just a little housekeeping there. So, today is Teachable Tuesday, and we are getting ready to share in a couple of books today. The Black History Reader by Dr. Claude Anderson. We're going to talk about some treaty information that I think Black Americans need a review on and need to know and understand. Growing up, I don't recall anyone really in my family talking about treaties and what those treaties actually meant to Black Americans. I think some of this information just needs to be reread, understood, understand what happened to Black Americans and Native Americans through these treaties, and what are some possible remedies for it today. Most of us have figured out by now that America does not keep her word to Native and Indigenous peoples. The water issue that happened, I believe that was 2017, into 2017, going into 2016, I believe, going into 2017, with the whole protest around the Dakota pipeline. All of that protest happened because they were violating treaties. They were violating Native American sovereign rights to their own land. And so, yeah, many of us realize that our country is not very good on keeping its word to the natives. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then, we're going to jump back into, as we begin to read thoroughly, Spare the Kids. Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. We started a little bit on chapter 1, and I will back up Actually, I don't have to back up because we're talking about a family conversation and why we need to have it. And so I'm going to keep reading her introduction here about this family conversation we need to have. Good morning to everyone. A lot of things that she covers in this book, believe it or not, tie into what's happening in the national news right now. Many people are talking about R. Kelly. They're talking about pedophilia. They're talking about the underage girls and those things. And believe it or not, those things, the early sexualization of girls, actually ties in to what we're going to be learning about here in Spare the Kids. And I don't want to get into too much about the R. Kelly piece because I did not watch it. For me personally, I stopped listening to R. Kelly music before I was saved. Yeah. I stopped listening to R. Kelly's music when I found out he married a 15-year-old girl. Like, I don't even understand why we're having this conversation because had people stopped listening to him then, we probably wouldn't be at this conversation on a national scale. But I stopped listening to him, when I found out about Aaliyah, because I think I'm not sure when Aaliyah was born, but I believe we were all in the same age group at that time. And so hearing about him marrying a 15-year-old girl was kind of like, okay, that's something's not right about that. And then to after that go on to hear about the video evidence of him with the other girl, and people are defending him or making it a race issue. Also, his supporters elect to say nothing. So for me, our community should have said something at the Aaliyah point. Of course, to me, it's not a race thing because Black America. I know people keep pointing to this as it's a Black America, Black community problem, but I actually disagree with that. There's some Uncle Neds and some Uncle Jeds and some Skeeters out there too. So I'm not even going to paint this as it's a Black community problem. This happens she was born in 79. Okay, yeah. So she was born 2 years after me, which means when I heard that story, I was like, I can't listen to this dude. This is not good. All right. So hearing that was enough to turn me off to listening to somebody who would do that. That was the end for me. More of if R. Kelly was white, they would have did a documentary on him like that. Actually, they have. A couple of my friends, we've been going at it in our inboxes, but actually they have been doing documentaries of white males. They have. All right, they have. They have. You have to look for it, but because this is hitting our community, we have to recognize that yes, a whole lot of things. Yes, the community needs to pay closer attention. Yes, some girls in the community are sexualized at a young age. I was one of them, all right? So I know I'm talking about. Some girls in the community are sexualized at a young age. Number three, people are saying, well, these girls are 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. They knew right from wrong. Let me tell you something. A young child, a young adult's brain is not fully formed until they're 21. In other words, they're not making decisions from the same place as adults. That's why they need parents. That's kind of why God designed it that way. So, yes, in the sense, some of these girls may have kind of known what they were doing, but from the sense of being mature enough in their mindset to make a decision to recognize that this man desiring me as a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl is not normal. Depending on the environment you're raised in, you that may not click with you, that's not normal. All right? Just saying. So, we have to understand that as a community, that while we're saying those girls knew what they were doing, they may have known to some extent, but even the law tells you that consent, that's why we have laws, because the law understands even though a young teenager can consent to sex, they know that they're not mature enough to understand the ramifications and the consequences of what they're consenting to. That's why we have consent laws. I'm just saying, people. And given some of the circumstances surrounding these girls giving themselves to him, there is possibly some coercion involved. There was definitely some parental grooming involved. In case you all don't know or you don't understand, or you've never been abused before, or you've never been in an environment of abuse, many times abusers start out by grooming the parents, not the children. Meaning they start with the parent first, they start gaining the trust of the parent, they become a financial safety net to the parent, so that when they want something from the parent or they are looking for the parent's permission to sort of mentor their young children, the parents are already convinced that this is a good person, okay? Because they've built a foundation of trust with that parent, so that anything that happens to their child and the child comes back to the parent and says, hey, this is happening, this person touched me in a wrong way, this person is saying things to me that I feel uncomfortable with, because they've already groomed the adult in that child's life. The adult is brushing off what the child is telling them. All right? This happens quite a bit, but I do want to emphasize it is not just a black community problem. It is not. All right? Talk to some of your white sisters and brothers, and you will understand it's not just a black community problem. All right? I do have some videos out where I have talked about generational rape. I've talked about the nature of rape. You can find it on my YouTube channel. I also have talked about child sexual abuse and child ritual abuse, of which a member of my family was involved in, and I actually witnessed to some of what happened. So I have a real life understanding of someone of an R. Kelly nature. All right. So I'm not talking off this at the side of my head or the side of my mouth. One thing I will tell you about when people say, why does it take a long time, or what took them so long to come forward? All you have to do is look around you at the responses people are getting right now from actually coming forward. From my understanding, according to the director of the Surviving R. Kelly film, none of the people who actually spoke out in the film are receiving any financial compensation for speaking out. That means there's no gain in it for them for speaking out and letting people know what has happened to them, how their parents were involved, if they were an adult. Nobody has gotten any financial compensation from it. So for all the people who are out there saying, oh, they must have been paid well to tell a lie, they weren't. Sometimes people are just tired of hiding in their trauma and what they've experienced. And if this has become a way for them to get it out, for it to finally be out in the open for them, for their conscience to be going through the process of having a clear conscience, then I believe that that's what many of them have done. Am I saying that R. Kelly cannot be redeemed? I wouldn't dare say that. But in order to be healed, you have to want to be healed. Okay? In order to be delivered, you definitely have to want deliverance. All right? You have to want deliverance. Yes, we can pray. We can pray for those who have been victimized. We can pray for R. Kelly and his early childhood victimization. But as one person said, he moved from being a victim to a predator a while ago. Because if you're a victim, you go get help. You ask for help. You go get therapy. You don't go and through years, through years become a predator. All right. So those are some of the things that I noticed was being said and is being said, and I think that this conversation is going to continue. I think it should. A couple of friends of mine have written some posts that I have shared on Daring Dialogues about safety measures and safety precautions and things that adults, not just adults, but people who are in education, people who are in religious settings, all of that, things that we can be doing to make sure that young boys and girls are in safe environments. Are in safe environments. One of the main things, and I'm going to move from this topic because the third book we're going to look at is Stamped from the Beginning. But one of the things that I have learned through education, because that's what my degree is in, one of the things they have always taught us is that when you are dealing with children, there's two kinds of supervision. And just hearing some of the reports and some of the comments being made about the documentary, I realized that those two types of supervision were rarely in place when these things were going on. The first supervision is sight supervision. That means if there's a young child in my care and I cannot see them and something happens to them, as an educator, I would have been considered responsible. And if it was something that was life threatening, I would have been considered liable. So, sight supervision, meaning if you are under my care, my eyes should be able to see your eyes, period. The other one is sound supervision. Sound supervision. So that means not only should I be able to see you, but I should be able to hear you. And this goes, I mean, I don't know about other people's education programs. I can't speak for that. But that was one of the main things that we learned in terms of child safety and protection in education was sight and sound supervision. You should be able to, if children are in your care, you should be able to have sight and sound supervision, meaning you should be able to see them and hear them. And if you look up and you don't see them and you don't hear them, then you better figure out why. You better go check on that child. You better find out where they are, period. And a lot of what I'm hearing about these stories, whether these girls were left in the care of their parents, whether their parents were going on these trips with them, whether, there was, people around, there seemed to be adults around, but the sight and sound supervision was not there, right? They were either going off in a corner somewhere with somebody, or a parent was in a trailer and the child was off somewhere else. All right? So I just want people to think about that. If you have children, if you have young children, even if you are at home with your child, because someone put up a post the other day about how they heard a thump in their house and they went around the corner and saw their child laid out. My first instinct was, why is your young child in your house somewhere that you can't see or hear them? Sight, sound, supervision. Those two things could have prevented some of the stuff that we're hearing about today. Being aware of where your child is, sight and sound supervision, especially if you're with your child. Now understand, parents allow their children to go off these days. But I know a lot of parents that use monitors, they use cameras now, especially if they have young children. They put camera monitors in their house so that if a nanny comes in or a babysitter comes in, they can go and they can actually check to see how that nanny or how that babysitter is treating their child when they're not there. That's sight, sound, supervision. So I look back on some of the things that I'm hearing, and I'm just thinking to myself, does everybody realize that? Does everybody realize that a part of a community being responsible for its children is sight, sound, supervision? Growing up, you know who was sight, sound, supervision? Your entire neighborhood. Back then, your entire neighborhood was sight, sound, supervision. That means wherever you went, whether it was down the street, whether it was around the corner, your family knew your neighbors. They knew your neighbors. They knew your neighborhood. So even if you left out the house and went walking down the street, there were enough neighbors who saw you. Some of them would wave, some of them would say hello, etc. But there were enough neighbors who were paying attention to you and your actions. All right. So we're going to move on here. And let's take a look first at the Black History Reader. And the question today is, how does the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty relate to Black people? How does this treaty relate to Black people? The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 was a treaty between the United States and Spain that sold the Spanish territory of Florida to the United States. The treaty also settled the fights that the two countries had long waged over slavery and the rights awarded to Black people who settled in Florida. Some Black settlers had always been free, and others had escaped from slavery. For 300 years, Spain had claimed the Florida territory that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean and along the Gulf Coast to mid-Texas. During that period, the Spanish government and the Catholic Church proclaimed Florida to be a haven for free blacks and runaways who escaped southern plantations to become Spanish citizens. Spain's offer of citizenship included physical protection and free land for blacks who accepted Catholicism. After a number of costly military conflicts, Spain fell on hard times and by 1819 had agreed to sell Florida to the U.S. for a mere 0.05 or 5 cents an acre or approximately $15 million. The sale was formalized in the Adams-Onis Treaty signed by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and ratified by the Senate in 1821. The terms of the sale should have protected blacks who were made U.S. citizens by the treaty, which conferred upon them the ownership of the Florida land in which they were working. But that did not happen. The Adams-Onis Treaty is another instance in which whites one-sidedly benefited from circumstances and assets created by Black people. The Adams-Onis Treaty expanded the nation's landmass and provided the opportunity for whites to steal land and benefits that had rightly belonged to Black people. Whites not only stole land ownership and freedom from blacks, but also severely punished them. Treaties are the highest laws of the land and have the strength of international law when they are made between sovereign nations. The treaty stipulations required the U.S. to honor the protections and rights that the Spanish crown had granted the slaves, free blacks, and Native Americans. It required the U.S. to treat people with African blood living free in Spanish Florida the same way that they treated the whites. The language in the Article 6 of Adams-Onis Treaty specifically bound the U.S. to these conditions, stating, "The inhabitants of the territories which His Catholic Majesty cedes to the U.S. shall be admitted to the enjoyment of all privileges, rights, and immunities of citizens of the U.S." It is clear that the terms of the treaty guaranteed all black settlers freedom, U.S. citizenship, and rights to their Florida land. It also gave them the right to migrate to any territory owned by Spain. Years before the Adams-Onis Treaty, the U.S. was under great pressure from white slaveholders who wanted their runaway slaves back. They also wanted the Florida land that the runaway slaves, free blacks, and Native Indians owned there. Black settlers' ownership was by Spanish decree and natural law. It was estimated that black settlers during the time owned approximately 40% of the land across North Florida. Slave owners petitioned General Andrew Jackson to use his military forces to help them seize the land and the slaves. General Jackson, a slave owner himself, was sympathetic and obliged the slaveholders. He made several illegal military incursions into Florida to capture runaways, take their land, and to destroy the black maroon towns and Seminole Indian villages that were protecting black settlers. Jackson had no military, executive, or congressional authority to invade Spanish Florida and to kill its black and Indian citizens. His actions nearly threw the U.S. into war with Spain over the incidents. The only reason Jackson's military invasions did not trigger a war at the time was that Spain was so financially weak that it preferred to sell Florida to the U.S. rather than get into another fight. As stated earlier, after the treaty was signed in 1821, Florida became an American territory and the inhabitants became U.S. citizens. However, that did not stop General Jackson from breaking the law. He committed numerous additional reprehensible acts to help the white slave owners. He repeatedly used the U.S. military to capture blacks in Florida and delivered them to slaveholders. In so doing, Jackson violated the U.S. Constitution that declared it illegal to bring slaves into the country after 1808. These intentional illegal actions on the part of Jackson and the complicity of the U.S. government, because it let those illegal acts occur, raise numerous questions. The answers to these questions create legal pathways to remedies for reparations for today's Black Americans. In the following section, I am intentionally framing detailed legal arguments that can be used to compel the U.S. government to provide reparations to Black Americans as a group. Violations of the Adams-Onis Treaty provide a strong statutory basis for reparations should Blacks pursue it. The following legal issues arise out of Articles 4, 5, 6, 9 of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Personally, I am looking for this generation of legal minds to begin to enact these lawsuits. That's all I'm saying. These articles articulate the citizenship and land rights granted by Spain to all black settlers and the rights that transferred with them upon the sale of Florida. To pursue reparations based on this treaty, blacks must develop a comprehensive legal strategy. The first step they must take is to demand the U.S. government provide a historical investigation into each legal issue that has been identified and make a formal claim. The most appropriate investigator should be the U.S. Department of the Interior and Congress. Second, given the realities of history, blacks must organize their legal scholars and elected officials to monitor government progress and to identify descendants of black Spanish settlers. Third, blacks must make restitution from the Adams-Onis Treaty a political issue, and organize the masses. These facts are some of the legal issues that blacks today must demand answers to as they pursue reparations based on the Adams-Onis Treaty. Number one, General Andrew Jackson and the United States accepted ownership of Florida as a new state, but ignored the numerous provisions of the treaty that Spain had made for free blacks, runaways, and black Seminole Indians. Two, what compensation is due to the descendants of the free blacks in Spanish Florida that General Andrew Jackson killed or shanghaied and delivered into slavery more than a generation after 1808, the date after which the Constitution prohibited bringing slaves into the country? Three, why didn't black Spanish citizenship and land ownership convert into citizenship and ownership in the United States as required by the treaty? Four, when Indians and black settlers were removed from Florida by the United States government, why weren't the millions of acres of Florida, land owned by black settlers and black Seminoles, held for them in accordance with the treaty? What happened to the ownership of that land? Five, do the descendants of black landowners still have entitlement to Florida land? They own land based on the Spanish decree and natural or divine law, but did not have paper documents such as deeds. Six, if the terms of the treaty are invalid, then the state of Florida still belongs to Spain. Nearly 2 centuries after the U.S. Congress signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, it is necessary to track ownership of the many Florida lands that had been owned by black Spanish settlers whose land rights should have followed them after the U.S. purchase. If the treaty is valid, then the obligations to black settlers must be honored. And seven, what happened to the sovereignty rights of the free black settlers who had lived throughout Florida for centuries and were forced into slavery or were later marched along the Trail of Tears with Native Indians to the Oklahoma Territory? What happened to their land? Were the owners compensated? Were their descendants compensated? Or is that a bill still waiting to be marked paid in full by the U.S. government? All very good questions that can start some legal proceedings. Hint, hint, black lawyers all over the world trying to figure out what legal precedents they need to be pursuing. All right, so we're going to stop there for today. Next week, Lord willing, we'll come back and we'll talk about another treaty, the 1866 Indian Treaties and the Black Freedmen and the Black Indians. Spare the kids. Why whooping children won't save Black America. Having a family conversation. The author continues to say in this book may also bring up some old wounds. It gets to the very foundation of what many of us have been taught by our family, church, and society. When it comes to discussions about hurting children's bodies, my number one concern is not hurting children's bodies. The one empathy I have for the adults who hit children comes from the fact that many of them are doing what they know to do. After all, most American parents were hit as children, and there is no universal parenting program designed to educate parents about the harms of hitting or non-physical alternatives. It's unrealistic to expect that people whose brains have been wired to hit and not see it as an act of violence will intuitively do the opposite. If you have children and you hit them, you might feel discomforted by the fact that your actions are connected to the trauma of whippings that you got as a child. It might tick you off to hear me say that you did not turn out fine because of the whoopings, but that you either turned out fine in spite of them, or that you are a survivor of unrecognized trauma. It might tick you off to hear me say that there are lots of folks walking around who may have been abused and don't even know it. My hope is that this book will be so disturbing that it will make it difficult for people to continue hitting children in peace. I have an idea of where resistance will come from, Everyone is always up in Black people's business, trying to tell us how to handle our lives. And we put up with this everywhere. But our homes, we say, belong to us. They may not be perfect, but they are ours. We're not going to have anybody coming into the only place we have and telling us what to do with the bodies of children that we created, feed, clothe, pray for, and worry about all day, every day. It doesn't matter if it's our neighbors, our teachers, medical, legal, or psychological experts, child protective services, the government, or even someone like me, a young Black woman with no children. No matter what, we believe it is our right to teach and discipline our children the way we see fit. But there's little acknowledgement that the world is so much more open today than at any other point in human history. We know a lot more now about our bodies thanks to science. But instead of adapting our parenting approach to meet the challenges of our current world, there are still many of us who long for the good old days when kids didn't act so bad and knew their place. We believe that the good old days were actually safer. The family unit was intact, there was no war on drugs, and schools didn't need metal detectors. People could get a good paying job and a house with only a high school diploma. Men settle scores with their fists and not guns. With so much going on in the world, there are lots of reasons why kids seem different today. Is it really because we're not whooping them enough? Tough love is often cited as the reason for this era. In the good old days, if you got out of line at home, you went to the backyard and you picked your own switch. Lots of us had to do this. I had to do it myself. Switches, belts, extension cords, wire hangers, shoes, and basically any object within reach was fair game for her married Black middle class adoptive mother who whooped her. The author says, I wasn't always beaten this way, of course. Sometimes it was a milder pop, but it all hurt. It all made me cry. It all made me afraid of her, which was the point, to hear my elders tell it. They said that if my adoptive mother didn't nip my behavior in the bud, bad things were doomed to happen. I'd try to rule over her. I would flunk out of school. I would become a teen mom. I would do jail time, or I would end up in an early grave. This is a situation we all recognize, but it was not unusual for my adoptive mother to take things much further. The writer says, I still have the physical scars from all those whoopings, and I spent the bulk of my childhood in New Jersey's foster care system until I aged out at 18. It is my experience with physical, verbal, and emotional abuse that sparked my interest in the historical treatment of Black children during and after slavery. I had a suspicion that my whoopings, though meted out solely by my adoptive mother, had something to do with history. She whooped me like her parents whooped her, and like her grandparents whooped her parents, and like her great grandparents whooped her grandparents, and like Massa whooped her great great grandparents. When I was a doctoral student in African American history at Rutgers University, I learned that the larger cultural devaluation of Black adults and children informs the way Black parents discipline their children. The lingering effects from the trauma of centuries of slavery and post-emancipation racism has produced what acclaimed author Joy DeGruy has described as multi-generational, maladaptive behaviors that continue to be passed on from Black parents, such as, I knew that girl was fast. She deserved what she got. That's a multi-generational maladaptive behavior passed on generationally in our community. Somebody tell me if they've ever heard a Black boy in the Black community call fast. I'll wait. Anybody? Anybody? Has anybody ever heard of a Black male in the Black community called fast? No? Me either. So where mannish, okay? But is mannish the same thing as fast? Pastor said, fast thinker. But what I'm saying is, we tack on a label, right, to demonize the early sexualization of a girl, but we don't ask why she is being sexualized. We don't ask what is happening to her. This is a multi-generational maladaptive behavior that Black community, we need to check. All right? These parents suffer from chronic stress and from what's known as post-traumatic slave syndrome, which we inherited from our enslaved ancestors. De Gruij's theory is similar to the results of research by doctors at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital, who discovered that the Jewish descendants of Holocaust survivors, the Ashkenazim, have undergone changes in their genetic structure as a result of their parents' trauma. This is also known as epigenetics, where, yes, you can undergo DNA changes as a result of your parents' trauma, and your parents underwent some changes as a result of their parents' trauma. So these inherited stress-related genes can shape the way people begin to cope with their environment and manifest in poor physical and mental health and in social dysfunction. This passed on trauma has not only led to the adoption of whipping as a parental method, it has also indoctrinated this same behavior in people's children and their children's children long after this kind of punishment has lost its relevance as a survival tactic on plantations and during the racial terror of Jim Crow. The white culture that traumatized generations of Black people and taught them to fear the whip now continues to blame and criminalize us for the results of what was taught to our former generations. In my child advocacy work and during my career as a journalist, I've interviewed scores of scientists, parents, children, child abuse survivors, and child welfare experts all around the country. Then, during the 2014 Adrian Peterson child abuse controversy and debates over the actions of Toya Graham, the infamous Baltimore mom who went upside her son's head during a race riot in April 2015. I took a lot of heat when I appeared on national television and said that these parents, regardless of their intentions, were wrong for hurting their children's bodies. I was adamant that a parent's intent does not trump the impact of violence against a child. In our media moment, we quickly reacted to those controversies, but then the country moved on from these stories without the necessary reflection, analysis, and solutions. And so here I am continuing the conversation with this book. Some of you may dismiss this book as biased, assuming that the abuse that I endured clouds my opinion. My whoopings and my scars have shaped the person I am today and the book in front of you. But I am not alone in my thinking. My views are equally shaped by data and research, which demonstrate the destructiveness of any level of hitting children. I see all forms of hitting as acts of violence, and I believe that children should enjoy the same right to bodily integrity as adults. Experts in the business of understanding child development and parenting practices universally affirm that there's no solid science to suggest that hitting children to any extent, regardless of race or ethnic background, is good for them or for our society. There is plenty of scientific evidence, however, demonstrating the long-term damage resulting from these types of punishment. This is true even when spankings don't leave marks or other serious physical injuries. The effects might not be apparent for years until after puberty or early adulthood. Studies by researchers at a number of universities have shown that corporal punishment and chronic stress can have a negative impact on children's brain development. As a child grows, certain parts of the brain are at vulnerable moments to stress. constant hollering, constant belittling, constant threatening, and hitting sets off biochemical responses that actually change the architecture of a child's brain and lays the groundwork for them to have a low IQ, a quick temper, aggressiveness, hypervigilance, delinquency, depression, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, future domestic violence, an inability to regulate their own impulses, dysfunctional relationships, and early intrusive sexual thoughts and activities. This abundance of research has not changed public opinion or practice. So, why are we not listening to the evidence? If this is what the evidence is showing, why do people continue to hit their children? If you don't want your child to have a low IQ, a quick temper, be aggressive, be hypervigilant, be delinquent, become suicidal, develop issues with drug and alcohol abuse, be subjected to a future domestic violence relationship because you have told them by your actions that hitting is love, have an inability to regulate impulses, dysfunctional relationships, why are we not listening to the evidence? Why do we continue hitting our children when we remain on the bottom rung of every measurement of health and progress? We're the most locked up, the most unhealthy, the most stressed out, the most continually demonized group of people in America. Whooping children has not saved us from any of this. We have been whooping for centuries and we have not turned out fine as a people. Could it be that all the violence is one of the root causes of our problems? How committed are we to passing on trauma to future generations? How devoted are we to pain and suffering and being victims? I understand the immediate urge to defend Black spaces, Black parents, and Black culture and identity. But we should consider that maybe, just maybe, white supremacy has done a masterful job of getting its victims of centuries of racial oppression to continue doing the trauma work on themselves and convinced us to call it love. I often say this about what people call proximity crime, or what the mainstream media likes to say, black on black crime, when it's actually proximity crime. I don't have to keep going around to kill you. I don't have to keep going around to kill you if I have now created the environment and I have now created the soundtrack of your life, rap music, that plays the same messaging to you over and over again about degrading yourself, about degrading the women, about degrading your mother, about killing your brain cells through drugs, and about killing each other over material things. I no longer have to be a physical presence in your neighborhood to kill you, because I've now created the environment over a period now of about 40 years where you'll just go and pick each other off yourselves. I've created the environment for your destruction. So now it is genocide. I like to call it genocide on autopilot. I don't have to put on a white hood and get on a horse and ride through your neighborhood at midnight. Now I have other people riding through your hood doing the same thing that I would have been doing. I just have changed the methodology. I've gotten a little smarter about how to get you to kill your own selves. I've gotten a little smarter about how to get your women to no longer want to bring life into this earth. Matter of fact, I've got some of your black women applauding and cheering the fact that they take out their own future generations and call it women's rights. So Yeah, white supremacy has done a masterful job of getting us to continue our own traumatizing of each other. They may have started it, but we have a responsibility in our community now to recognize when the trauma is still ongoing, recognize the stem, and kill it at the root. And that may require some work from you. That may require some changing of the mind. They may require some renewing of the mind. Once you understand what something is doing to a child, you as the parent, you as the adult ought to say, I'm the one who has to renew my mind around this subject matter. If we can insist on continuing this tradition, let us at least acknowledge what we are really doing, where this programming really comes from, and what the real long-term consequences are. I also recognize that we understandably have a profound distrust of white experts. After all, these are some of the same professionals who use science, medicine, statistics, and the media to call us inferior or pathological and to shore up their own sense of identity and mythical sense of superiority. How do you trust the people who tell you to stop beating your children when they're constantly creating and sustaining the conditions that compel us to do whatever we feel we need to in order to maintain our child's safety? It is a cruel double-edged sword. And yet, yearly statistics gathered by the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System consistently show that Black children, and somebody not going to want to hear this, but it's the data, okay? Black children are mistreated and killed by their family members at a significantly higher rate than both white and Latino children. They're also killed at a higher rate than they are by the police. Now just let that sink in. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to just think on that. So we talk about police brutality in our community, but the data shows that Black parents are killing their children at a higher rate than the police are. Just go research the data. You don't have to believe me. All right. Social workers and district attorneys will tell you that most of these family members are not monsters. They just simply saw a slap across the face or a seemingly innocuous pop sometimes result in a serious injury to the child or even a fatality. I was angry. I slapped my child. They fell. They hit their head. They're dead. Can't bring the child back. In a fit of anger, I responded. Now my child is no longer here. Other cases escalate slowly. Parents don't start off with extension cords. It gets to the point when they believe a belt or a hand no longer works. In fact, many district attorneys I've talked to over the years say it's not bad parents intentionally hurting their children who end up with convictions for child abuse or homicide. It's those who started spanking and amped up as the child continued to grow and get bigger. We tell ourselves that what we're doing is different, saying, well, I wouldn't whip my child with a switch or an extension cord. I wouldn't leave welts or bruises or break bones. I wouldn't make my child bleed. I wouldn't whoop them when I'm angry. I would sit them down and explain to them why they're being punished. But I'm here to tell you, I've read hundreds of case files. Those parents who got that knock on the door from Child Protective Services and who found themselves standing in front of a judge being convicted for abuse said the same things. They were genuinely shocked when they were told that their parenting practices were against the law. Until that moment, they too had been told that this was the right way to raise a Black child. It was the way they were raised. They didn't end up in the emergency room. Their mama and them didn't go to jail, and getting whooped and scarred with weapons wasn't called abuse. Black people, we must rethink our approach. In 2014, black children who made up around 14% of the total child population accounted for 24% of children in foster care, according to the most recent annual report published by Children's Bureau. Factors such as low birth rate, crushing poverty, having a young mother, low education, and having no father listed on a birth certificate place children at a higher risk for being reported to Child Protective Services, which are highly concentrated in poor black neighborhoods. If we're honest, the child welfare industry in this country is about policing poverty and reinforcing the powerlessness of people of color. When we hit our children, we put them at risk of becoming among the thousands of black children who enter the foster care system every year and have a 50% longer stay than children of other ethnicities, which is the express lane to the juvenile justice system and ultimately to an adult prison. Our youth, who are often bounced from home to home and placed in facilities far away from their parents and everything they know, often fail to get adopted or even returned home, which puts them at more risk for not graduating from high school or transitioning into independent living. When we hit black children, we put them at risk for being suspended and expelled from school and becoming yet another victim in the school to prison pipeline. When we hit black children, we put them at risk for entering a foster care system that forces disempowering young people to take psychotropic medicines against their will. Seriously. A 2015 report from the Franklin Law Group, a child advocacy organization based in Baltimore, found that since the 1990s, when I was in the foster care system, the author writes, there has been a 55% increase, get this, in prescribing psychotropic medications to foster children. Why? So even if they don't need them, they prescribe them. Foster kids, including infants, are prescribed mind-altering drugs at rates 9 times higher than children not in foster care. I have met kids in care who were taking 4 or 5 psychotropic medications at a time, even though there was no real medical evidence to support the regimen. Black children, especially girls, are diagnosed with higher rates and prescribed off-label medications with black box warnings, indicating that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does not sanction the drug for children. So not only are their lives being endangered, not only are they being taken out of the home, but after they're taken out of the home, they are further abused by a system that drugs them. So if they didn't have mental issues before they got into the system, what kind of issues would they have after the system has given them psychotropic drugs that they didn't need? The ramifications of this are staggering. Numerous reports on the unregulated medication of children have found that long-term use of the drugs causes serious side effects and long-term consequences. Taking these medications can suppress and disrupt normal brain development and function, alters chemical levels of the brain, and impacts mood and behavior. And guess what? A young person who has a mood and behavior altering is now seen as a problem, right? An educational problem, a society problem, a problem all around. So, as we close today, they have also been found to cause neurological disorders, the development of breasts in boys, brain shrinkage, obesity, cardiovascular issues, violent behavior, suicidal ideation, restlessness, low energy, aggression, diabetes, insomnia, memory loss, and shortening of the lifespan by 25 years. The drugs are often prescribed for the traumatized and grieving children as a way to control their behavior instead of giving them counseling, which are often not available because they are more expensive than the drugs. Kids labeled violent, explosive, or difficult become easier to manage when they are chemically sedated. So rather than getting them the help that they need under these conditions in the care of the government, they simply sedate them with psychotropic drugs, altering them. Knowing this, it should be no surprise that black children are stereotyped as being angry or overly aggressive. Intentionally or not, it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. This explains why a largely white social service system and psychiatric community misdiagnose and continue to over medicate our youth. When we whoop our children, we also put them at risk of joining tens of thousands of young people who age out of a foster care system and then struggle badly, with more than 1 in 5 becoming homeless after the age 18. Instead of making a successful transition into productive adulthood, one national study found that 38% of former foster care youth had emotional problems and chronic health conditions. So, when we return next week, Lord willing, we will continue talking about the importance of having this family or this black community conversation. All right? I want to thank you for tuning in today. I know today's subjects and topics were pretty difficult. We did not get to Stamp from the Beginning, but we will pick up with Stamp from the Beginning next Tuesday. All right? If you have not ordered this book and you are a parent, I encourage you to order this book, Spare the Kids by Dr. Stacy Patton. The information is specifically geared toward the black family and the black community, but it's helpful for anyone who wants to improve their relationship with their children, who wants to understand more about the history behind corporal punishment, and who is actually looking for data driven information, not just emotions, but data driven information on the topic. All right. Again, I want to thank you for your time and attention. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out today and be light. Take care and God bless.